everybody see this okay? So it is a pleasure for me to be here and to be in Charleston. And I honestly think when Pete and I started talking about this opportunity and the ability for me to come talk about this research that has been almost 20 years in the making now, when I realized we did not plan it intentionally to be on September 11th, but here we are. It is on September 11th. And I think that for me, that makes me more reflective of what I'm about to say, even though what I've been thinking about and how I think it's very important for us to apply the economic way of thinking to the issue of terrorism, which of course is still with us today. But I do want to say that this is not just neat and clever, right? This is important, an important issue that is still with us, and we need thoughtful people thinking about how to make the world a safer, better, and more prosperous place. And so I think we need to bring rigor to this issue of terrorism, and that's what I want to do a little bit tonight. But I'd like to start just telling you my background, because how I came to study Al-Qaeda from an economic point of view was in some ways an accident of where I found myself on 9/11. I was a graduate student at George Mason University. I was living with my parents and my two younger brothers at the time. I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia, which is not very far from the Pentagon. And back in those days, we had phones, but they weren't smart, right? We had cell phones, but they weren't smartphones. So you didn't use them as your alarm clock. You didn't, touch a button and get all sorts of information within 12 seconds of being awake in the morning, right? Maybe there was something that was better about life in those days. But I woke up and my alarm clock woke me up, and I had a 9:30 public choice class on the Fairfax campus of George Mason University. And in traffic, it would normally take me about 45 minutes to get there. So I used an alarm clock. I woke up, I got ready. I never turned a TV on, and I never turned a radio on. And so I got in the car, and I had no idea what had happened until I turned the car radio on, which is interestingly not something we do that much anymore, right? We listen to Pandora or podcasts. So back then, things were a little bit different. And as soon as I heard the news that one of the Twin Towers had been hit, I turned my car around and I went home. And I think I did that day what every American did, which was I watched the news in, kind of stunned silence all day. My church that night had a candlelight prayer vigil. I went to that. And I don't really remember what I did the next few days. George Mason was closed for a while. I had been invited as a graduate student to go to my first Liberty Fund colloquium. That was canceled. I couldn't tell you how long it was until I flew in a plane again. So that was what life was like in the days and months after 9/11. And at the time, I was a research assistant for a professor named Charles Rowley, who has passed away at this time. But he was my dissertation chair, or I knew he was going to be my dissertation chair, but I hadn't figured out what I was going to write about yet. And so shortly after 9/11, at the time, he was the editor of a journal called Public Choice, which is still around today. So those of you in the Public Choice Center know this, right? And he said, look, economists must talk about this issue. We're not going to be invited to the table to talk about it. It's not obvious that economists, to policymakers that is, it's not obvious that economists have something to say, but he thought we did. And so he said, would you like to co-author a paper with me on terrorism? And I'll guarantee that it gets published in this journal. And of course, as a young graduate student, I just said yes to that, right? I didn't know anything about terrorism. I had never read one article about it before. I didn't know who the researchers were. But I wanted a peer-reviewed journal article as a graduate student, and I trusted my professor, so I said, sure. So we co-authored a paper together, and that was the beginning of where I would find myself as a young graduate student. I decided I was going to dedicate the rest of my years at George Mason to studying this. So my dissertation was on the political economy of Al-Qaeda, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I think that you can extend economic theory to not just understand Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not the only terrorist group we have to worry about, but it's certainly still around. And so what I wanted to do as an economist, and why I think economics is really important for these issues, is that it allows us to ask different questions, right? We ask questions that maybe other people don't ask. And so that's why my professor thought it was so important that we be included in the conversation. Here's the other thing as a public choice scholar that he was worried about, and he was right. He said there's going to be a lot of policy that comes very quickly out of Washington, D.C., because the pressure on policymakers and the pressure on the President of the United States is going to be immense. People are terrified, and they want something to be done right away. And so my professor understood how policymaking works, and he knew that this legislation was going to come out very fast, and it wasn't going to be very well thought out. And he saw that as a problem, because he knows resources are scarce, and he understands unintended consequences. So he was very supportive of my interest in pursuing this as a dissertation. As Will mentioned, I always thought I wanted to be an academic, which is kind of where I find myself now. But he said, you need to go work for the CIA, because you've been thinking about this, you've been constructing a model for how you think Al-Qaeda operates, go do it. So I said, okay. So I applied to work for the CIA. It took me about 9 months, which is kind of pretty standard. And as a kind of a recent graduate of George Mason, I was working at the CIA as a financial analyst and our economic analyst doing terror finance. And so what we were trying to figure out was who had the money, where it was going, or not just money, but resources, assets, establishing NGOs overnight to funnel money, all that kind of stuff. So if you've seen the Amazon series Jack Ryan, that's what I did, but it didn't work like that, so it wasn't very sexy or glamorous. But there's still, of course, people working on that today, and I think we need to continue to bring economics to how we think about what terrorists do and why. So I'm going to start at the beginning in terms of where I started in my dissertation and in my research, and kind of build from there. I think Mises was an important contributor to economic theory, and this comes out in the early 20th century, and so this is like a 900-page book. I'm summarizing it in one PowerPoint slide. But I think this is really critical. Here's what he says. For human beings to engage in a choice, for them to take an action to do something, these kind of three conditions must be present, okay? They must hold. And then human beings do something, they decide, right? They get out of inaction and into action. And the first is we experience a state of uneasiness, right? So you're uneasy about your current state of affairs, and you don't like that. We don't like to be uneasy, right? We want to improve our state of well-being, our state of happiness, etc. So number two is we have a vision for a better outcome. So the most basic example that we face every day of this is you wake up in the morning and your stomach is growling, right? You've gone a long time without eating. Your body needs fuel. You're uneasy about that situation. You don't like to be hungry, right? But it's not that hard of a problem, at least for most of us in this room, right? You have a vision. There's a world in which I can alleviate temporarily those hunger pains. And then number three, which I think is really important, we take conscious and purposeful steps to get there. Conscious and purposeful. Now, this is not rocket science, right? You're like, okay, I'm with you. This is not super technical. Why is this important? This is really the foundation of my entire economic theory of terrorism, is right here. If you listen to the language that was coming out from policymakers, presidents, legislators, think tanks, all sorts of different types of folks, right after 9/11, and I would say even today, the language goes something like this. Terrorists are not like us. They want different things than us, which is true, right? But to say that they're crazy is a step too far, in my opinion, as an economist. And I think that it actually sets us on the wrong path for what to do about it. So see, economists use the word rational in a very specific way. We don't mean rational as in you always make good choices, right? Morally justified choices, right? Virtuous choices. What we mean by rational is that you calculate costs and benefits. Every human being does this. This is where I'm starting with the members of Al-Qaeda, with bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda. My assumptions about their behavior is that they are conscious and purposeful in what they are doing. That actually makes the attacks of 9/11 even more terrifying to me when I think about it. It wasn't an accident of lunatics. It was well thought out, honed, specialized, trained for, and executed with near perfection. That's scary. There's something to be scared about there, right? This is not kind of crazy people. So starting with this premise, I think, gets us to ask different types of questions about what the appropriate policy response is, right? Because here's the thing about people who are, quote unquote, crazy in the traditional way we use that word. You really can't fix crazy, can you? You can lock it up, you can shoot it, and maybe you have to do that anyway. But the point here is that if someone is deranged, they don't respond to incentives. And my whole starting framework is the members of Al-Qaeda felt uneasy about their affairs. They had a vision for alleviating that uneasiness, and they took conscious and purposeful steps to get there, right? So what that opens up to us, I believe, is there's a world in which terrorism is not what they choose to change their state of affairs. It's a possibility that we can make terrorism expensive. That's thinking like an economist, right? Because what we care about are the people who engage in the terrorism, the people who fund the terrorism. That's who we're worried about, are we not? And so we want to think about what kind of world is required for them to not do that anymore. So very simply, again, we're never tonight at least going to be very far from basic economics, micro. I started thinking about terrorism along supply and demand curves. There is a downward sloping demand curve for terrorism. What does that mean? Well, it means that the people who like terrorism, who benefit from it, who consume it, if it's cheaper for them, right, they might consume more relative to other things. And there's an upward sloping supply for terrorism. So how do we think about that? It means that there's a certain category of people that are the suppliers. They get up in the morning and they make sure Al-Qaeda is ready, funded, has foot soldiers, has resources, has a plan, right? So although terrorism and Al-Qaeda in particular, I mean, you don't go to a store as a donor. And I'm not being facetious here, right? But if you are somebody who likes terrorism, you want the world, you want Al-Qaeda to succeed, you don't go up to a storefront and purchase an attack. It's not like going to Walmart or Starbucks or Amazon. You don't put it in your cart, you give a certain amount of money, and they carry out an attack for you. It's more kind of operationally like a nonprofit, right? Where they have donors and they have volunteers. But that matters because, again, we want to question the motives and the intentions of those donors and volunteers. And it seems to me that, and if you look at the literature, lots of people are really interested in the hijackers, the people who are willing to die for the cause of terrorism, but we've seen lots of people over the scope of human history be willing to die for causes. So to me, that is not the most interesting segment of this dynamic here. I think probably one of the, at least what I was worried about and still am, kind of curious about is who are the people who are willing to write a check to Al-Qaeda, but they would never put themselves in an airplane and run it into a building, right? Who are those people? What do they gain? What do they want to see happen? And again, how do you change the incentives that those people face? How do you change their demands? Right? One way an economist would think about it is, well, what are the alternatives, right? What are the substitutes? And how do you craft other substitutes? What are the substitutes for an organization like Al-Qaeda? And how does that change over time? So one of the first things that I had to do when I was thinking about this, and you have to realize, so I defended my dissertation in 2005. Shortly after 9/11, the 9/11 Commission report was declassified. So I was getting all of my information essentially from this one declassified document, in addition to trying to track down credible news stories about what was going on. So kind of fast forward to today, we know a lot more in some ways than I think we did in the early days of when we were acquiring information about Al-Qaeda and what they had been up to. But I think the most important part of starting this analysis, in addition to laying out the economic theory, is to say, well, what is terrorism? Because if we define it too broadly, then it's easy to throw everything in there that we don't like. And that's not helpful from a policy perspective. It's also not helpful from an incentives perspective, right? We want to understand why, in particular, terrorists are engaging in this type of very costly, it seems to us like very costly activity, right? Many of us might say, well, I'm not happy with the current, president of the United States, or I don't like my congressman. But you're not joining a terrorist group to solve that problem. The question is why, right? Why in wealthy, free societies is terrorism much smaller of a phenomenon or less of a phenomenon than it is in societies that aren't free and that don't have a lot of wealth possibilities, right? So there's something going on there that we need to think about. But defining it is important. So I'm really relying a lot on the State Department definition here, but I'm kind of adding a few things. So one is, this is me being an economist. Terrorism is always, we're thinking about it in the context of cost-benefit analysis. That's what we do as economists. That's really all we do, right? So we're saying the terrorists have an end, and their end is subject to the constraints that they face. So for Al-Qaeda, they have a mission, they have an organization, and I will say, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but Al-Qaeda in 2019 is very different than it was when I was researching it. And there's a couple reasons for that I'll talk about. But we're always talking about people who are behaving according to purposes that fulfill their ends, okay? There's not one cause of terrorism, so that's the second bullet here. Terrorism is not unicausal, and if you look at the literature, both from economists and political scientists, lots of people want to come up with like the silver bullet, right? Like if you're poor, if you're from a poor country, you're more likely to be a terrorist. If you're uneducated, you're more likely to be a terrorist. If you're, a member of a certain religion, you're more likely to be a terrorist. And the research has really kind of shown us that there's no silver bullet. There's not one way to profile a terrorist or who's going to become a terrorist, right? So again, we're looking at individual actors and the incentives that they face. So we have to think about the context in which they find themselves. Again, we're talking about people who wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to join Al-Qaeda because it's going to help me and my family in some way, or I'm going to donate to Al-Qaeda because I really like what they're trying to do in the world, right? That's how we're thinking about the people that are involved in these organizations. And terrorism can be actualized by an individual or a group. So individual terrorism, we tend today to call this lone wolf terrorism. This is kind of what Al-Qaeda in the later years post bin Laden has morphed into. It's much more of small, decentralized groups that claim the Al-Qaeda brand, but they're not being directed by the central leadership. That was not true on 9/11. So really, bin Laden's death changed the organization a lot because he had very much of a cult of personality. He was able to raise money, and he was able to recruit people. He was a very charismatic leader of the organization. When an organization takes a hit after the removal of a charismatic leader, it's possible, and in this case, it is what happened, that the organization changes a bit. But Al-Qaeda in the early years was a top-down, centrally run organization. And terrorists attack non-combatants, really important, right? Terrorists are attacking civilians and people who have not directly done anything to them first. So it's not a retaliation. We're not talking about freedom fighters who are revolting up against their government. That's different. We want to be very specific about how we're analyzing people in this particular type of behavior, okay? So they distinguish their targets. For Al-Qaeda, they're looking at Western targets, right? They're looking at American targets. Their choices on 9/11 of hitting iconic New York buildings, very intentional. It was an attack on American influence in the world, and to do that, what do you attack? You attack these iconic buildings that signify capitalism in the West and things like this. And then you attack iconic government buildings, etc., okay? So To understand Al-Qaeda, again, part of what I wanted to do is I wanted to understand the institutional nexus in which this emerged. So this type of behavior human behavior is organic, right? It evolves over time. So Al-Qaeda comes to be, and again, the question that I think, especially on a day like today, that we wrestle with and we reflect on is, how were they able to do it? And really, what has changed in life after 9/11? And how has Al-Qaeda changed? So to do that, we need to tell a little bit of history of kind of international affairs. So, and again, there's none of this is a critique per se of U.S. policy, but we want to track U.S. international policy along with tracking the movements of Al-Qaeda as an organization, because again, they're responding to what they think are things that have wronged them. Whether or not you agree with U.S. policy under Carter or Reagan and anybody else is not relevant to what they feel. So we're talking about the things they're reacting to, okay? So a very important event happens in 1979 in the Middle East, which is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, okay? So that's 1979, but what's gone on before this, post-World War II, is the international demand for petroleum products is going up because the world is getting richer and populations are growing, right? So you have this pressure on the need for crude oil to fuel all these consumer products. And as it turns out, right, crude oil is one of the world's most politicized goods, right? So there's a lot of government ownership in different countries of this particular commodity. So that changes the political dynamics of what's going on. So Jimmy Carter, in his State of the Union address in 1980, announces the Carter Doctrine. In the Carter Doctrine, this is the first time an American president has stated that the United States will defend their interests with military power, if need be, in the Persian Gulf. So this is a formal statement that's a new statement by an American president. Why is it relevant? I'm going to talk about that, but bin Laden is in particular reacting to that. Again, it doesn't mean we're not commenting on the policy per se, but this is part of what he's reacting against. Then you have the Reagan Doctrine, which basically restates the Carter Doctrine and puts more monetary resources behind it, okay? So the United States starts to aid, Soviet resistant forces in the region. Operation Cyclone becomes one of the largest CIA covert operations that gets underway in 1979 and goes through 1989. It starts out with like $500,000 a year. That was its funding in 1979. The next year it goes up to $30 million. So we're ratcheting up the resources that we're dedicating to protecting international interests, protection against the Soviet invasion. So there's a lot of things going on, right? There's economic interests and there's political interests. And the United States has an interest in being involved in that, okay? So the other thing that's happening is we are training and providing weapons and munitions to Soviet resistant fighters in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen. Well, from what we know, and again, a lot of this is classified, not in my head, but just classified, right? So it's hard to get access to all of it. I don't believe that people that have access to this information believe that bin Laden was directly trained by U.S. forces. So it's not the belief that he was directly assisted by U.S. forces. However, he was being brought up by his spiritual mentor at the time, who was a Wahhabi, a very extreme version of radical Islam, which believes in taking active force against non-combatants, which is not part of the traditional Islamic faith. So he's being radicalized at this time, right? But he's part of this movement. So the ISI, so we're training, we're equipping, we're providing munitions, and again, the whole point here is to fight the Soviets and protect them from getting power in the region. So this is just a couple pictures. This is Ronald Reagan, and this is kind of while Operation Cyclone is going on, he's meeting with the Afghan Mujahideen. And in this time, Al-Qaeda is born. So this is kind of the leadership of Al-Qaeda in the early days. They're founded in 1988. Osama bin Laden issues like an 8,000-word fatwa to announce the presence of his organization. Al-Qaeda is translated as the base. And so the intention, I believe, was to be grounded in one place, not to have to move around, but to establish an organization that would never, I don't believe he ever wanted to act as a state, but this is that's my take from the research. Of course, I don't know for sure. So we have bin Laden, Azzam, and al-Zawahiri. Azzam is bin Laden's spiritual mentor. When he's young, of course, bin Laden has his own kind of personal backstory, which is very complicated, but he comes from an extremely wealthy family of billionaires. His father is a construction magnate. It's interesting when you think about that. I only bring it up because he used some of his personal fortune to fund Al-Qaeda in its early years, but he didn't fund 9/11 with his personal fortune, we don't believe, at least not wholly. But, you know, he had a lot of opportunities in life to live the good life, didn't he? To kind of be like a rich playboy, to live off of his father's earnings. But he chose to go in a very different direction. This picture in the middle is a very kind of proud picture for Al-Qaeda. So this is bin Laden with a Pakistani journalist. And the gun that's hanging on the wall in the background is a gun that they had acquired from one of the Russian soldiers. So they're proudly displaying this gun as like, look, we got at least one guy, we got his gun. But this is the kind of early years and the environment in which Al-Qaeda starts. That's just a picture of their flag, the Al-Qaeda flag. So they immediately start branding themselves. So what I want you to think about, and I think it's hard to think about this when we think about the emotions, the raw emotions of what happened to this country on 9/11. But we have to think about the technical workings of Al-Qaeda as an organization, right? So they start out with a mission, which is released, like I said, by bin Laden in his fatwa. They have a name, they have a brand, they have a flag. They recruit employees. They get donations. So they're behaving in a very kind of specific and in somewhat traditional organizational fashion. So the first part of my research is looking at the historical and institutional context in which Al-Qaeda emerges. What are they reacting to, and what kind of conditions, country conditions, are present as they come up? Then the next part of my research really focuses on how does Al-Qaeda organize itself? Is it a firm? Is it a nonprofit? Is it a church? Is it a state? How do I think about that? So I'll walk you through some of that. But basically, they kind of have a checkered history in terms of where they started. They started in Saudi Arabia under pressure from the United States and allied governments. They get kicked out of Saudi Arabia. In 1992, they moved to Sudan. Under international pressure, they get kicked out of Sudan in 1996, and they end up in Afghanistan. Of course, who's in Afghanistan and along the Pakistani border when Al-Qaeda comes? The Taliban, right? So now you have a competing group that also acts as a terrorist organization. So if you look kind of back into some of the history of this, Al-Qaeda goes to Afghanistan trying to be peaceful with the Taliban, and they indeed did work together in the early years, but they had a falling out and they no longer work together in any way. They're separate organizations. So what happens after they get kicked out of Sudan and they kind of make their home in Afghanistan? When I was thinking about this, there's something in political science, the political science research, a theory by Mansur Olson, and he talks about roving versus stationary bandits. And I really thought about that a lot when I was trying to characterize what does Al-Qaeda want? I mean, they're just getting pushed out of these countries, right? That's really kind of expensive from a transactions cost point of view, right? You have to pick up, you have to move to another place, then you get kicked out, you have to pick up and move to another place. It would be much easier if you could just stay in one spot, right? But they had a hard time doing that at the beginning. It is my belief that if bin Laden had had his way, I think he would have wanted to stay in Saudi Arabia, but that was probably never a very realistic goal considering Saudi Arabia's relationship with the United States. So there was a lot of pressure, and he got kicked out just 4 years after forming his organization. 19 of the out of the 19 hijackers on the 9/11 airplane attacks, 15 were from Saudi Arabia. So he had a recruiting base and network there. I think it was expensive for him to have to move around. But that shows you what some international pressure can do. Note, what it did not do was dissipate Al-Qaeda. So again, when we think about policy, the reason I'm going through this detailed story is that we want smart policy that's going to stop terrorism. We have to understand how and why they behave, right? Again, not crazy people. These are very calculating people. These are people who are smart, who could do other things. So we need to understand what's going to make them demand less terrorism, from a very basic way of saying that. So what then when Al-Qaeda's in Afghanistan, what are they doing? Well, now they're training, right? So if you're even a kind of cursory student of Adam Smith, what Adam Smith said was division of labor leads to specialization, and specialization makes us more productive, right? Usually in market economies, that's a good thing. What they're doing over the next few years is they're specializing, they're practicing, they're training, they're honing their skills. So this is just a list of some of the attacks that Al-Qaeda is launching in the early years. They're staying relatively close to home, right? They don't in their first year go to the United States, but they do that later, 1993, first World Trade Center attack. They're bombing embassies, right? USS Cole bombing, an assassination. They're getting ready. They're training. Right? And then, of course, they end with the attack that they, at the time, were most proud about and talked about and claimed right away. So the 9/11 attacks, this is Khalik Sheikh Mohammed. When I was at the agency, it was a kind of a coveted position as an analyst to interview him. So he's been in Gitmo forever, and he's been interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And the only good thing about that is that he's told the same story. So a lot of the 9/11 Commission report is based on detainee interviews from him. He was the mastermind of the 9/11 attack. He was very proud of the attack, right? And he actually wanted the attack to be bigger. So not a lot of people know this. It's kind of buried in the 9/11 Commission report. But the original September 11th attacks were supposed to be dual global attacks. The plan was to attack the east coast of the United States, simultaneously attacking Japan. And I would just ask you to think about what that would have been like had they done that. I mean, we live in a war, we still live in the war on terror, right? It's in full force. We're very afraid of what terrorists are capable of. Terrorists today have a lot of resources. They have more resources today than they did in 2001. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, right? So terrorism, I think, is a threat that we have to face. But imagine the international global fear that would have ensued if they had been successful in that. Well, they cut off the Japan part of the attack. They decided not to do it, and here's why. Remember that first slide I talked about conscious and purposeful behavior? The worst thing that a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda, right, terrorism is theater. It's theater. It's not done in private. It's very public by definition, by necessity. Right? So if the joint legs of this attack had been carried out and one of them had been thwarted, Al-Qaeda would probably be over as an organization, much, kind of very swiftly. So terrorists don't want to get caught. So prudence suggests that they should not bite off more than they can chew. Right? You need to do what you want to do, but do it well. And doing it well means not getting intercepted and not getting caught. And to just suggest to you how difficult that would have been, I mean, what they did was difficult. But what they wanted to do would have been stunningly difficult. And here's why. Again, people don't really think about this, but does anybody know what happened after the first Twin Tower was struck by an airplane and that was discovered? What do you think happened to every other airplane that was either getting ready to take off or in the sky? It had to be grounded immediately. So that takes seconds. I think the data is that there's like 23,000 flights a day. That's a lot. So imagine air traffic controls everywhere across the globe are grounding planes. There's a really nice story about the humanity that rises up out of these terrible circumstances, which is that there were a lot of planes that were inbound for the East Coast, and obviously they couldn't land. So U.S. air traffic control called Canada and asked to be able to land in a bunch of different Canadian airports. A very small Canadian airport, I think it was Newfoundland, but I'm not sure, agreed to take as many airplanes as they could hold. So all these airplanes landed on these tarmacs. People were sitting in the planes. There were not enough, it's like a town of like 10,000 people. And you've got, 5,000 people in airplanes on the tarmacs. So people were eventually released to hospitals. They slept in gyms. These Canadian citizens brought them potluck meals. There weren't even enough restaurants to feed them. It's a really amazing story about how human beings rush to help each other, which is what I like to focus on this day in particular. But I just want you to think about that from the terrorist point of view. They understand that the minute the first tower is hit, everything goes into action. And if you've read, kind of stories about this, F-16s were waiting to shoot down planes, right? So it's going to be very hard to do that. So the point I'm making here is that they're very cunning and they're very calculating, and it was prudent for them from a cost-benefit perspective to not go too big, right? Because you don't want to get caught. And they didn't, at least not on that day. All right, so what are the goals of Al-Qaeda? And we could ask this for any other terrorist organization. I would say that I think the way that I'm approaching some of these economic questions, we can apply them to any terrorist group, but I think to really understand deeply, we have to do case studies and really dig into the research. But what I wanted to figure out, again, what are the goals of the organization and who are the donors? So this is a copy of a document that was found in 2002 in a raid, and it's a list of the early funders of Al-Qaeda. And some of the people on the list are recipients and some of them are donors. Bin Laden is listed multiple times as a recipient. But these are people who are established businessmen. They're wealthy, they're educated, they have a home, they have a family. So again, it doesn't fit the narrative of they're poor people who are disenfranchised and they're not educated. There's something else going on. They're actually wealthy people, right? They're bankers, they're former ministers, right? At the time, from this estimation, we believe that Al-Qaeda operated on about $30 million a year, which is not very much. The 9/11 attacks, we believe, cost about $500,000. So it's not about money. Success, from their point of view, is not about money. 3,000 people were killed that day. Countless of resources wasted in having to rebuild buildings, right? So it doesn't take a lot of money to execute a lot of damage. So it's not a money issue per se. It's a capabilities issue. Bin Laden's fortune, again, in the early days of Al-Qaeda, funded some of the organization, but there's also engaging in heroin trade. ISIS today is much more complicated than Al-Qaeda was then. So ISIS is involved in both legal and illegal activities to raise money. So it's very hard to track where they're getting their money. But we know that Al-Qaeda was very well funded at the time. They're more well funded now than they were then. So Al-Qaeda financially has grown since 9/11, not declined. And ISIS, wasn't even a thing at the time. And so we have new terrorist groups that we didn't even have before. So we have a lot of important policy questions that we need to address ourselves to. The next thing I wanted to do, as I mentioned to you, is I really wanted to try to understand how Al-Qaeda operated. It's not really a firm, I would call it a paramilitary, top-down type of organization. So in the early days, again, before bin Laden's death, this was a centrally planned organization, and they kind of operated on a hub and spoke model. So they had these small cells. The cells were intentionally small, so we believe 8 to 15 people in a cell, and they were highly specialized, right? If you look at the 9/11 hijackers, there were some that were trained explicitly to be pilots, and they came to the United States earlier than the people who were explicitly trained to take down the muscle men, to take down the stewardesses and the pilots on the plane. So there were different categories of jobs, and in these small cells, they're trained, they're secluded from their families. So we don't believe that, at least for 9/11, that anybody was there as a member of Al-Qaeda involuntarily. We believe that they were there of their own free will, but that they were paid, right? So they were paid and taken care of in this environment, and their families were promised payments after death. So they also knew what they were getting into. Though that begs a lot of questions for us, doesn't it? Because again, a lot of us might be disenfranchised with politics or legal systems, but we don't do these things. So what's the difference? Today, Al-Qaeda is a very different organization. I would also like to say that this is a demonstration of how bad I am at constructing a PowerPoint image. But what I was trying to convey here is that Al-Qaeda is more like a franchise today. What's important about Al-Qaeda today is the brand, not the leadership. Okay, the brand, not the leadership. So lots of people who claim an affiliation with Al-Qaeda, it's a very loose affiliation by what we know. Right? So there's kind of 4 main groups here that are active today. But if you look at the research, there's more than kind of 25 different small decentralized groups that claim affiliation with Al-Qaeda. But we don't believe it exists in the same centrally planned top-down formation that it did before. So now we're talking about a franchise organization. Does that make them more or less dangerous? I think that's an open question. But in some ways, they don't have the cult of personality of bin Laden that allows them to raise money, right? That somebody that can tell them what to do, et cetera. So this is not a graph that I've created, but it comes from the Global Terrorism Database. And this just shows you the number of terrorism fatalities by region. So the colors are just different regions of the world. I think what I really want to point out to you is the overall trend here, which is disheartening. In the world since 9/11, we've gotten more terrorism, not less. So I think, one of the things we can learn from life since 9/11 is that we might need to rethink how we do things. I'm not saying you don't do anything at all, right? But as economists, we know that the resources that we're dedicating to fight terrorism are scarce. And it would seem to be that those resources are not, at least on its face, getting us where we want to be. And the war on terror is a very expensive war that we fight. So Brown University has a major research project called The Costs of War, and what they do is they try to calculate the total costs of the war on terror, which includes lifetime veteran benefits. So it's the most comprehensive dollar figure that we can get, right? Lifetime veteran benefits for people who have been engaged in the war on terror. And by their estimations, $5.6 trillion and 225,000 deaths. That's all deaths, right? Not just US citizens. We have the Patriot Act, which of course, there's costs and benefits to these things. There's more surveillance, indefinite detention of immigrants. It has expanded the powers of law enforcement to search and seize, to search phone records. All of these things, again, it's easy for me to critique them, but I think the point that we have to ask is, are they effectively reducing the demand for terrorism? Because as an economist, that's what we should care about. There's a supply of terrorism, there's a demand for terrorism. Are we effectively reducing the demand for terrorism? Because what does economics teach us? Supply is demand in disguise. It's one of the most critical lessons of economics. Supply is demand in disguise. Supply doesn't exist for its own sake, right? So nobody's going to dedicate millions of dollars to support and fund a terrorist organization if nobody wants that terrorist organization around. So the question of kind of political economy and policy is, again, what can we do to reduce that demand? It's my view that a lot of these activities, while understandable, and maybe some of them are necessary, are almost exclusively focused on the supply of terrorism. So to get to Charleston today, I had to get on an airplane, right? And to get on the airplane, what did I have to do? I had to go through the TSA stuff at the airport, right? That is a result of 9/11. It's a reasonable result. If terrorists are going to use airplanes to crash into buildings, we should make sure that airplanes are safe and not subject to easy hijacking. So it's not unreasonable, right? But the question is, has the TSA made air traffic safer? And that's an open question. And the other kind of thing that the economist brings to it is that it's a very expensive undertaking to run the TSA, right? It costs us scarce resources. So I think what we need to think about is, what are we going to do about this? Here's the kind of underbelly of all this that's very unsettling to me. And I live in Loudoun County, which is kind of a suburb of DC. I mean, we're still commutable. We're kind of far. We're like 25 miles from the center of the city. And all of these organizations have humongous campuses out in Loudoun County. And so what I did was I did a little research on the top 5 companies that get the biggest government contracts as it pertains to the war on terror and military-industrial contracts. And these are 2018 numbers, and they're in the billions. So Lockheed Martin, $36.3 billion, Raytheon, $13 billion. They both have campuses right down the street from my house, et cetera. If you add up these numbers of the top 5 beneficiaries, right, private companies who stand to gain a lot from the U.S. being involved in the international war on terror, it's $90 billion. That's more than the GDP of Luxembourg. So my point there is that that's a lot of resources. Right? And my other point here is the incentives are skewed, right? So the thing about Boeing or Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics is they actually stand to benefit from us being in a perpetual state of war because it brings them dollars to their bottom line, regardless of whether the war is effective. Regardless of your position on our war in Afghanistan, you should not be okay with that if you care about scarcity. Right? Those resources have multiple and competing ends, and this stuff has unintended consequences. It's easy for me to criticize. I don't want it to sound like I'm criticizing everybody who works for those organizations or whatever. But I think the point here is that I don't think that we're getting the results that we need to get, and we're spending a lot of money on it. So think about how you would act if that was the case over some problem in your private life. You would redirect. Right? You would redirect. So this is another graph that kind of shows a similar story, right? Which is post 9/11. We're seeing a surge in terrorism, in particular in Nigeria. Right? Boko Haram, a new terrorist group that has kind of been birthed out of this whole new environment. So the bottom line is that I guess it's easy to diagnose some of these problems. I think the harder thing is to rethink policy that's effectively, again, going to be directed at the demand curve. If your policy is only directed at the supply curve, then it's like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. It's not going to do much for you, right? Focusing on the supply curve is a short-term defensive tactic. What I would say is that it's necessary but not sufficient. If we want to reduce the amount of terrorists in the world and reduce them to talking heads who don't have any firepower behind them, we're going to have to reduce the demand curve. And I'm not sure so far we're there. So one thing that I like to think about, and Pete asked me when we were talking earlier, are you going to end on this note? Because I think it is a note of potential optimism, is that I think that economic freedom is part of the answer here. So the little backstory, you may all know what economic freedom is, you may not. Economic freedom is something that we can measure across countries. It's kind of birthed from Milton Friedman, very famous economist in the 20th century, who kind of said, hey, we talk about prosperity all the time, but what do we really mean? Let's measure it, right? Let's measure it. So when we're measuring the economic freedom of a country, what we're measuring is the ease of doing business, right? The ability to buy and sell as you see fit. So autonomy over your choices that doesn't impede on other people's autonomy, right? And so it's actually a really good metric for understanding how a society is doing. We measure things like level of regulations, how big the government is, do they have a rule of law, how sound is their currency, etc. And so what I wanted to do, this is just a little correlation, not causation, but I wanted to say, okay, what are the top countries that are the worst terrorist havens? And I went to the Global Terrorism Database, and here's what we find. Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, and India. So then I went to the Economic Freedom of the World report, and I looked up there the data. And it's not a coincidence that for some, they're in such bad shape institutionally that we can't even give them a score, because we can't get reliable data to give them a score. That's a bad sign, right? But if you look at some of these, their scores are not very good. And of course, there's a lot of data, behind this big number here, this aggregate number that you see. But again, I ask the question, why are people who are purposeful and conscious waking up and joining a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda? They have a reason for it. We can change the reason. But I think to change the reason, we have to change the institutional environment, right? So that's going to change the demand curve. What I think we want to stay away from doing, have you ever gone to an arcade and played whack-a-mole? Right? You whack the mole and the mole pops up in a different spot. And then you whack that mole and it pops up in a different spot. We don't want our international foreign policy to be international whack-a-mole, because you're going to get temporary benefits. We've really making ISIS take a hit in the last 2 years. That's good. But here's the thing. If you haven't reduced the demand for ISIS, then you're just going to get something else in its head, in its face. Right? So we have to ultimately think about the institutional environment in which terrorism thrives, and how do you change that? I think trade, although it sounds silly, is a path towards that. It's not the only answer. You need security, right? You need to make sure airplanes are safe. You need to do all those things. But trade breeds trust, right? Trade turns enemies into friendlier people. Not best friends, maybe, right? Cadillaxy, that's what it means, going from enemies to friends. So how do we think about regional trade in Afghanistan and Pakistan? Because I'm here to tell you that that doesn't just benefit them, it benefits us, right? And I think it's almost a free lunch. There's no real free lunches, but it's not that hard to think about trade. It's so fundamental to our nature. So I'm going to stop there. That was a lot. Thank you.